Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's January 10th, 2026, and as Yogi Berra said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. Last week, I laid down 5 predictions for 2026, one of which was that the Maduro regime would remain in power throughout the duration of 2026, and less than 48 hours after recording that, U.S. Special Forces go into Venezuela, arrest Maduro, and bring him back to the United States. If I want to get all rules lawyerly here, I could say that the Maduro regime, per se, still appears to be in power. The vice president, who is a Maduro loyalist, is now the acting president of Venezuela. And as far as the Trump regime is publicly making known, there is no intention, at least now, to topple the regime, but instead just to indict Maduro. And so now the Maduro number 2, a woman named Delcy Rodriguez, assumes the presidency, and the U.S. threat of gunboat diplomacy feels real to her. And even though it is the same regime, there is the implicit threat that there could be another decapitation or potentially escalation if big multinational energy producing conglomerates loosely based in the United States are not allowed to operate more freely in Venezuela. If the regime doesn't crack down on emigration from Venezuela, potentially into the United States, to prevent more Tren de la Agua, or whatever the drug gang that was operating in Colorado, that was a story during the 2024 presidential campaign. If Venezuela effectively doesn't do more of the bidding of the United States, there is the threat that anyone else could be decapitated just as easily. And so even though the Maduro regime per se will still be in power, it will be gelded, it'll be neutered. So I could try to retreat to that to defend my prediction, but that runs the risk of the God of the Gaps type of arguments taking place when next week there are actual boots on the ground in Venezuela and the entire regime is toppled and the Nobel Prize winning peace activist regime overthrows the old Maduro regime, gets put into power, and then I have even more egg on my face. So instead of retreating strongly to that position, I will own missing that first prediction about the Maduro regime retaining power through 2026, and instead reclinate back to a couple other predictions that I do think are made more likely and stronger because of this prediction falling through. Another prediction was that gold would hit 5,000 by the end of calendar year 2026. It started the calendar year at 4,300, and just in the last week since the overthrow, or at least removal of Maduro, the crippling of the Maduro regime, gold has shot up to $4,500. So it's a $200 move in the span of a week, which is something over the last several months hasn't felt that out of the ordinary, but historically that is just remarkably unprecedented in the history of the U.S. dollar. As we mentioned previously, just 25 years ago, the entire price of an ounce of gold was $300, and now we see that sort of move in the course of a single week. What the entire price of gold was, this thing that has served as money, as a monetary store of value for as far as recorded history exists, and presumably prior to that as well. Just in the last 25 years, over the course of 10,000 years, it never moved more than $300 in a generation, and now, just in the last quarter century, it's moved $300 in a couple of weeks, sometimes even in the course of a single day. But one major reason for the most recent surge in the price of gold is that Venezuela is an important Chinese ally in the Western Hemisphere, a country that China does a lot of business with and gets a lot of energy exports from. It's a bigger deal for Venezuela. China gets something like 5% of its energy imports from Venezuela, but Venezuela's biggest export market for energy is China. And China, of course, for decades now has run enormous trade surpluses. And it is from those surpluses that a lot of U.S. treasuries are purchased and held and rolled over. It is effectively China, to a large extent, bankrolling the debt issuance of the United States. And China has done that because the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency. And even though there is some rhetorical acrimony at various times to varying degrees between the U.S. government and the Chinese state, China underwrites the American-based global debt system because it has been perceived, though that's changing now, that the U.S. dollar is effectively the new international standard for medium for exchange. A role that gold has historically played over time, but in the digital age, moving a big, clunky, valuable metal across the world doesn't make sense. There are too many externalities, too many deadweight costs associated with it, and so the US dollar has taken its place as something that facilitates exchanges much more cleanly and with greater rapidity. And that is more easily verifiable, trackable than gold is. Yes, there are, of course, complex, sophisticated operations in money laundering, but those things can ultimately be traced in a way that's more difficult to trace gold. In the case of the United States, it's reported that the U.S. government has over 8,000 tons of gold, but there hasn't been an audit in decades, and so nobody really knows. But if China moves or continues to move, it has already done this, if it increasingly moves from buying U.S. debt to instead buying gold with its trade surpluses, well, then we will continue to see an increase in the dollar-denominated price of gold, and that is exactly what we've seen in the last week, and it is almost certainly in large part because China has, in response to this decapitation strike on Venezuela, moved to purchase more gold and fewer treasuries. And if, over the course of the next year, there is a full-scale invasion and toppling of the Venezuelan regime, we can presume that the bit of extra gold buying that happened this week will be turned into overdrive. And so we've at least created a hedge. I'm confident in saying that if the Maduro prediction turns out to be unequivocally incorrect, then the gold prediction will be unequivocally correct. The other influence on predictions made last week that this Venezuelan strike will have an effect on, presumably, is the result of the midterms in November. Prior to the Maduro ousting, American public support for attacking Venezuela was remarkably tepid, especially given the recent historical context of conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan, where there was strong support for intervention. On the eve of the invasion of Afghanistan in 2002 to topple the Taliban, American public support was over 85%. Now with Venezuela, it is more, prior to the invasion, was more on the order of 35 to 40%. Now that it's happened, YouGov Economist conducted a poll this week, and even with the apparent success of the strike, only 48% of Americans support it and 52% oppose. So it's close to a 50-50, but historically with these invasions, public support is at its zenith right after the invasion occurs, right after it begins. And the story in the subsequent months and years is a decline, a continual decline in support. And so for the U.S. government's actions to already be underwater in terms of public support does not bode well for this being something that Republicans will benefit from in the midterms. To rehash why it seemed improbable that the U.S. government would take out the Maduro regime, presumably as a favor to Marco Rubio, is because Cuba presents a more politically palatable target and one that the neocon regime is every bit as eager to topple as is the case with Venezuela. And so the reasoning was that if some political capital was going to be expended on military action in Latin America, well, why not Cuba instead of Venezuela? And the answer might be that it is not an either-or issue, but in fact that it will turn out to be both. From Al Jazeera this week, quote, United States President Donald Trump has threatened military action against his Colombian counterpart, Gustavo Petro, following Washington's abduction of Venezuela's leader, and said he believed the government in Cuba, too, was likely to fall soon. Trump told reporters on board Air Force One that Venezuela and Colombian were, quote, very sick, unquote, and that the government in Bogota was run by, quote, a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States, unquote. Quoting again in the immediate next paragraph, because this is poor writing, quote, and he's not going to be doing it very long, let me tell you, unquote, Trump said, referring to Petro. When asked if he meant a U.S. operation against Colombia, Trump said, quote, sounds good to me, unquote. Further in the article, speaking to reporters on Air Force One, Trump insisted that the U.S. remains, quote, in charge, unquote, of Venezuela, even though the country's Supreme Court has appointed Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as interim leader. He also reiterated threats to send the U.S. military back to Venezuela if it, quote, doesn't behave, unquote. Trump said a lot of Cubans were killed in the U.S. raid on Caracas, adding that an American military intervention in Cuba was unnecessary because the island appears ready to fall on its own. Quote, Cuba is ready to fall, he said. Cuba now has no income. They got all of their income from Venezuela, from the Venezuelan oil. They're not getting any of it. Cuba literally is ready to fall, unquote. So there are obvious echoes of the axis of evil plans of the neocons in the early 2000s to not end with Afghanistan, but instead that Afghanistan was just the beginning and that Iraq and Iran and North Korea and Syria, Egypt, Libya, a whole host of other countries in the Middle East were set to fall like dominoes as the American military went from country to country, toppling regimes and installing pliable neoliberal puppets of their own. There is a mega Israel angle here as well. For one, perceptually and rhetorically, this provides cover for the Trump administration's foreign policy that has come under a lot of criticism as being directed for and by Israel, with all other concerns globally being subjugated to the needs of Israel in the Levant. But the opening up of this Don Roe doctrine, with its focus in the Western Hemisphere, in Southern and Central America, and the Caribbean, if Cuba is one of the next targets, well, that takes a lot of pressure off of the idea that it's all about Israel. And yet one seemingly unavoidable consequence of an invasion of Iran in the coming months or years is the closing of the Straits of Hormuz and a big global spike in the price of oil. And if that is in the cards, well, what better country to control effectively the United States and by extension Israel to control? Venezuela is reported to have the single largest oil reserves of any country in the world, more than Saudi Arabia or Canada, Iran, Iraq, the United States. Venezuela has the most. And so if China is undercutting the purchasing power of the dollar, well, that's going to make funding all of these foreign policy adventures in Latin America and presumably in this telling against Iran and in the Middle East in the future, that's going to make it that much more difficult to fund those things. What better way to fund them than to have control of the country with the world's largest oil reserves exactly when global oil prices are soaring? Venezuela is said to have over 18%, so almost 1 in 5 barrels of proven oil reserves in the world. And so the U.S. government, with 4% of the world's population, gaining control of 18% of the world's oil reserves, well, from an imperial perspective, it is not difficult to see the perceived benefit in controlling Venezuela. Turning to domestic news, albeit from a source on the other side of the Atlantic, from The Guardian this week, the nonprofit charged by Congress with allocating funds to NPR, PBS, and other U.S. public radio and television stations announced it is dissolving after massive federal funding cuts under Donald Trump. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or CPB, announced on Monday that its board of directors had voted to dissolve the organization after nearly 60 years in operation. The CPB received annually $500 million, $500 million, which is, to normal people, quite a bit of money, but in terms of the U.S. federal budget is a rounding error. It's peanuts. And that was the argument apologists for state-run media, which is what PBS and NPR are. They are state-run media. We in the West, the neoliberal framing of things, talk about how state-run media is a problem, and we believe in freedom of speech and liberalism in the United States, and that it is who we are to allow people to express themselves and not have a dictatorial, oppressive state shut down people's personal freedoms. And yet we have in PBS and NPR state-run media propaganda outlets that fellate the neoliberal managerial state in ways that would make Al Jazeera or Russia Today blush. NPR is absolutely Orwellian. There's a program on NPR, or at least there was, entitled All Things Considered. As a title, that's a crime against the English language. Nothing is considered except for the pre-approved neoliberal slop. They don't even consider everything inside of the Overton window, let alone anything outside of it. Anyway, the argument has been that because it's such a small amount of the budget, it's not really a big deal. And anyway, it's not like NPR and PBS need it. It doesn't constitute a majority of their funding. It's more on the order of 15 to 20% of the total funding for these outlets. Although that is misleading because a lot of the money that goes to the CPB isn't directly given to NPR or PBS, but is given to other NGO operations and nonprofits that then fund PBS and NPR. And so while 15 or 20% is taken directly from the federal budget and given to state media in the form of NPR and PBS, more of it is laundered from the federal budget to these other organizations that then give it to NPR and PBS. And that is why they are now panicking about the dissolution of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Estimates are somewhere in the vicinity of 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 of these NPR and PBS affiliates are not going to be able to survive the year with this lack of CPB funding. And so on the one hand, the funding is a rounding error for the federal budget, but without it, Big Bird will die. While on the other hand, it's not really state-run media because NPR and PBS don't even need this federal funding to survive. It just helps shore things up, helps them operate in more rural areas or underserved communities, as the lingo goes. There's a parallel here with rhetoric about immigration. In fact, there are a lot of parallels with a lot of the neoliberal rhetoric where they are, if taken to their logical conclusions, are inherently self-contradictory, but it doesn't matter that they don't make rigorous logical sense because the purpose is propagandistic and rhetorical, not dialectical, which is a pretentious way of saying they want to maintain their funding and they want to give you a reason, no matter what your perspective is, to support that funding. And implied in all of that is, of course, you are a good person if you support the funding. Anyway, as for the parallel with immigration, on the one hand, immigrants are better than lazy, entitled Americans. These immigrants will do the jobs that Americans won't do, and without them, the economy will collapse. The cheap chalupas will become more expensive, and they'll taste worse. And the immigrants are the ones who create all of the new jobs. They're the entrepreneurs who are opening up new businesses like fraudulent daycare centers that don't exist. And so immigrants are, in fact, the manifestation of the American dream in real time, and we're lucky to have them, and they make life so much better in so many ways for the natives, the American citizens who were born here, while out of the other side of their mouth, we're told that it's a death sentence to prevent these huddled masses of wretches from coming here because they are refugees fleeing persecution and oppression, and they won't survive on their own. And so it's who we are to take them in and to give them a helping hand and a warm blanket and food and housing and education and medical services and political enfranchisement. So it's great to take away state funding for this state-run media operation. NPR and PBS will continue to exist in some form. While between 15 and 20% came from the CPB, around 35% comes from individual donations, which leaves the bulk of the funding coming from the aforementioned nonprofit so-called charitable foundations, which serve largely as money laundering and influence peddling fronts for billionaire elites like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. But at the very least, this will cause some damage to the self-important prestige that came with being associated with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So 2 cheers for the Trump administration here. 1, reducing the power of state media, and with the pardoning of the J6 protesters at the beginning of the second Trump administration, releasing hundreds of political prisoners. Because what were the J6ers if not that, if not political prisoners? The vast majority were completely peaceful and only were arrested for trespassing on property that is putatively publicly owned and therefore theirs. And yeah, so Globo Homo is going to continue to use the existence of state-run media and political prisoners in other countries to enact the empire's desired foreign policy aims. But at least we have a little bit less state-run media and political prisoners thanks to the Trump administration. Speaking of NPR, several years ago, they did a long segment, maybe it was a full programming hour, on IQ. That was risible. IQ and the associations with it are the most reliable, replicable findings in all of the social sciences. It's not even close. There's over a century of literature on it. The National Longitudinal Study of Youth, which formed the basis of the Herrnstein and Murray 1994 book, The Bell Curve, shows that IQ is associated with virtually every other human characteristic and trait, and how those traits manifest in terms of occupational competence. They're the one job that was not found to be positively correlated with intelligence was potato peeling, presumably because at some point, if the task is so menial, so repetitive, so robotic, that it almost inevitably causes those performing the tasks to have their minds wander and therefore make mistakes. Because after all, you can cut yourself pretty substantially when peeling potatoes. But the broader takeaway from that is that it's not just professors and surgeons and astrophysicists who occupationally benefit from having higher intelligence. It's bus drivers and bank tellers and construction managers who do as well. And despite the propaganda of ideological equalists through hit pieces like this program on intelligence, I'm recalling from several years ago, most people intuit the validity of IQ. The economist YouGov recently ran a poll illustrating as much. They asked, how well do you think IQ tests measure a person's overall intelligence? 64% responded either very well or somewhat well, with another 12% saying they were not sure. So fewer than 1 in 4, less than 25% said either not very well or not at all well. And this result didn't vary much by political orientation. Among Democrats, 64% of respondents said that IQ either measures overall intelligence very well or somewhat well, compared to among Republicans it being 73%. So there wasn't a big partisan difference there. Where people lose their stuff and why state-funded media outlets like NPR are so strident in their attacks on the very idea of intelligence is because moving from the level of the individual to a group level is where the perceived problems with the equalist ideology come into conflict. It's okay to think that different people have different IQs. After all, that's what makes leftists better than conservatives, is because they are more intelligent than those conservatives. They listen to NPR and PBS instead of Fox News. But if black dysfunction is a consequence of lower intelligence, or if immigration is lowering the average intelligence, the average IQ of Western countries, well, that's a big perceived political and cultural problem. And so intelligence is culturally permitted to exist at the individual level, but it is not able to be taken to its logical conclusion from there, and the implications of changes in intelligence over time for populations. As an interesting aside, it's unclear if the association between intelligence and life outcomes in the Western world is increasing or decreasing, or maybe muddling along unchanged. AI is threatening or promising to make a lot of the work that historically was associated with higher intelligence, diligence in figuring things out on one's own, doing the studying and scholarship and planning, the brain work that constituted the bulk of the work that white-collar professionals did in the latter half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century. A lot of that is looking like it may become obsolete and far faster than the presumed robotic revolution that was going to do away with the need for a lot of menial tasks. Instead, it looks like the workmen, the vocational skills, the HVAC type of people who have other skill sets rather than just raw intelligence. Although, to loop back around to what we talked about previously, there is virtually no occupation that intelligence doesn't provide some benefit for, but there are other skills that have more of a premium in physical work, where while intelligence still provides a benefit, doesn't provide nearly the same type of benefit that it would for a surgeon or a high-powered lawyer. And when I say benefit, I should specify that I mean it in the enlightened hedonism of the modern Western world, the modern developed world. From an evolutionary perspective, if intelligence was beneficial in the past, and it probably was, especially for men, it is becoming increasingly less so, and in fact is becoming deleterious rather than salubrious when it comes to reproductive fitness. Because since the reproductive revolution of the 60s and the widespread availability of birth control and abortion and the ability to, quote, family plan, unquote, the upshot has been that intelligence and fertility have become increasingly inversely correlated. That is, the more intelligent a person is, the less likely they are to have children. And that is especially the case with women. And so while intelligence might make you a better worker drone for Goldman Sachs, it might also be an answer to Fermi's paradox, which is that we become so intelligent that we, as a species, cease to exist. And so maybe after all, a lot of those intelligent, barren, childless, liberal women who get into things like Buddhism, which teaches that existence is the problem and the end of it is the way to enlightenment, well, they have it right. For my money, though, if the formula you're running results in the extinction of the species, there's probably a problem in the formula. And that problem, or that set of problems, are a big part of the problem of modernity. But I suppose that is a struggle that will continue to be fought at least as long as there are humans around to fight it. And that thought about nihilism and questions of existence, self-worth, and the inherent value of humanity as a species, as a population, as a creature of spiritual significance. I took a little time to look at the released manifesto of the 2023 Nashville Presbyterian Church parochial elementary school shooting in Nashville, where a 28-year-old woman pretending to be a man murdered 3 elementary-aged kids and 3 adults before being taken out by police. The shooter, born Audrey Hale, who changed her name to Aiden Hale in an attempt to present as a man, is a macabre illustration of white self-hate and a good case study in how anti-white and by extension anti-natural in a holistic sense, and that the biological imperative for an organism is to first survive and then to reproduce, how the reigning neoliberal anti-white orthodoxy is an existential threat for the well-being, the flourishing of humanity in general and heritage Americans in particular. On page 5 of the manifesto, Hale lists a bunch of cartoons to watch, and the number 1 is something called Samurai Jack. The number 2 is Avatar: The Last Airbender. That is followed by several pages devoted to Pokemon. There are pages about cards to collect and various Pokemon creatures to draw, to Final Fantasy, which is a Japanese gaming and broader media series. This is for Zoomers and Millennials. This is the weeb manifestation of white self-hate. And that sounds a little bit extreme. It's not to say that any sort of embrace of non-European indicative of self-hate, but it is an example of someone reaching outside of themselves to try to find something as foreign to their own sense of self as they can, because those are the things that they feel a sort of natural affinity for. And this is the nerd, the geek manifestation of that. Corresponding manifestation of this for the less cerebral, more athletic, jock orientation of this aversion to embracing one's own identity is the black gangster sports type of culture that many younger whites in the West adopt. On page 22, Hale writes, quote, "I was born wrong," unquote. Hale was a female pretending to be a man. Those trainees are the saddest because despite all the BS about alleged white male privilege, the reality is that going from a youngish woman to an outwardly presenting man means going from having the world bend over backwards for you at every opportunity. This can be observed in public easily by just looking at how everyone treats 20-year-old women in terms of deferring to them and trying to flirt with them and paying attention to them, having men of all ages ogle them. To go from that to some sad simulacrum of a young man is devastating, because while social status is highest for nubile women, it is lowest for young men, because while it is fertility signs that make women attractive, it is outward signs of status that make men attractive, and younger men tend to have less wealth and less prestige, less evidence of social status, things like being married. There is a reason that women tend to find married men more attractive than unmarried men, because it indicates some sort of selection that has already occurred, and women tend to be very status focused. And so if other women, or at least one other woman, has found this man attractive enough to marry, well, that makes him more attractive than if he were single, because that indicates that maybe he's a loser that nobody wants for whatever reason. And so if Audrey Hale thought, as a average looking woman in her 20s, if she thought she didn't get the attention she deserved then while pretending to become a man, and almost definitionally not a very appealing version of a man, was going to ameliorate her situation, she was tragically wrong. And Hale, who is a white woman, on page 26, wrote, quote, "No brown girls, no love. Brown love is the most beautiful," unquote. And this rambling manifesto is full of references to brown girls, brown beauty that Hale is clearly infatuated with. There are very few redactions in the over 100-page manifesto, such as it is. I think manifesto is a little bit of a grandiose term. It's more like the scribblings of a disturbed person who is racked with self-hatred, who hates everything about her identity. But of course, this lustful desire for a non-white woman is another manifestation of self-loathing, white self-loathing. Even in the privacy of her own diary, it is highly unlikely, especially given the other cultural and political affiliations Hale has, that she would even in private write something like, "Oh, beautiful white woman," or say anything neutral, let alone positive, about white identity in any aspect. To the contrary, on page 96, quote, "Kill those kids, those crackers, going to private fancy schools with those fancy khakis and sports backpacks, whiter daddies, Mustangs, and convertibles. Fuck you, little shits. I wish to shoot you weak-ass dicks with your mop yellow hair. Kill all you little crackers, bunch of little faggots with your white privileges." Getting back to the unrequited love of the brown object of desire, on page 34, we get, quote, "Brown girls have the nicest skin, especially yours," unquote. Then on page 40, in all caps, we get written across half the page, "white nothingness," followed by, quote, "My parents aren't rich. They work hard for their money, so we don't end up homeless, yet I still feel bad," unquote. And the subtext there is because I'm white, and so I'm more privileged than even Barack Obama's daughters. And though my parents do work hard, I still feel bad. I still have this white privilege that I can't extirpate from myself, and it just makes me a bad person. And though I feel like I can try to escape my gender, I can't really escape my race. I am just white nothingness. There is influence from the green agenda, too, that I think is inherently misanthropic and anti-human. On page 41, we get, quote, "My existence is meaningless. I'm better as dirt for the world's sake. Nature will be more in place. My dead body will help the earth grow," unquote. On page 47, we get more antithesis to her own identity, to who she is fundamentally. Quote, I was called woman, lady, and ma'am all in the same day. I hate everything about my gender, unquote. On page 51, more swooning about the brown object of desire. Quote, the 27th was a beautiful night, just like my brown girl. She looked so beautiful that night. I could not take my eyes off of her. Call it lust or pervertedness. I know who I am attracted to, and I can't unchange that. It's like my soul is spellbound to her spirit or something, unquote. Hating oneself also often means hating one's family. On page 94, we get in all caps, fuck you. Most fathers suck, and then it's redacted, the name, but presumably it is her father. Anyway, most fathers suck, redacted, name included. Then later in the page, quote, throw the Bible in his face, tell him his religion sucks, then shoot him, point blank, dead. Either way, I'm going to die, and people will too, sooner or later. Pray to your God that your children will live, because I will try to kill all your kids. Hold on to them while you can. Your children are going to die, unquote. So now I'm not actually sure, given that context, if Hale is talking about her father or some other father that she knows, or maybe her father is being perceived as a manifestation of the fathers of a lot of children in the neighborhood or in her community. But anyway, clearly this desire to kill is directed at those who share in many ways an identity that she shares culturally and religiously and racially. She is not projecting this anger outward. It is very much directed internally. And as we have talked about previously, that is a real problem that people of Northwestern European descent, the white people, heritage Americans, especially those who are outbred, struggle mightily with, and that is self-hatred and suicide. Suicide is a white thing, homicide is a black thing. And the killing spree that Hale went on was effectively, had to have been known, even given her delusion, she had to have known that it was effectively a suicide mission. One that would lead ultimately to her self-erasure, which is what she seemingly so desperately wanted, but was too cowardly to directly do on her own. Also, briefly, I forgot to mention on page 108, we have, quote, old cranky men all should die, unquote. So the tragic figure of Hale is in many ways an illustration, a manifestation of this anti-white, anti-Western, anti-Christendom zeitgeist that has infected everything in the Western world. It's in all of the institutions, it's all in the cultural shaping power centers, it's in entertainment, it's in media, it's in academia, it's in increasingly even in churches. It's in the antithesis to the nuclear family, which is darkly remarkable because the nuclear family in a lot of ways is the great leveler in the sexual marketplace. A man gets consistency, something most men historically didn't get because alphas got most of the women and the rest got nothing. That is what polygamy is about. It's the men on the top, that top 10 or 20%, getting their choice of women, and most men being left out in the cold. Monogamy was a way to level that playing field for men. But monogamy also provides what women desperately want, which is commitment. Men want sex, and they give away commitment for the sex. Women want commitment, and they'll give away sex to get it. And sex-selective abortions notwithstanding, and they too have been reduced over time, the sexual distribution of offspring is basically 50-50. So in a nuclear straight system, or even a closeted system where homosexuals pretend to be heterosexual for the purposes of marriage and reproduction, in that system, everybody at least gets something. But now with the breakdown of the nuclear family and the return of hypergamy through dating apps and non-committal sexual relationships and the increase in all the different alphabet identities, homosexuality and gender bending, all of that equalizing force that the nuclear family as the norm brought to society has been uprooted and is being destroyed. As aforementioned, to call this a manifesto is a decision of convenience more than strictly semantic precision. But near the end of this thing, all the way on page 106, Hale lists her favorite all-time movie, which is And I didn't see this coming, The Lion King. It's ironic because the movie is all about embracing who you are instead of trying to be something you're not. It's about the inherent unworkability of trying to have things function against nature as things that they are not. And it's about the devastation that comes from turning your back on your own identity. We have that in Scar, who kills his own nephew and impoverishes his own species, other lions, to bring in hyenas. And it's not especially difficult to see the lions as heritage Americans and the hyenas as the scabs, the foreign scabs brought in from all over the world to replace and subjugate them. But it's more directly manifest in the main protagonist, in Simba, who is deceitfully led to believe that there is something shameful about his past. He is tricked into thinking that he killed his own father, that he, from the get-go, from when he was a little cub, that he had done something so unforgivable, just being who he was, that it was in his nature. And so the only thing he could possibly do to justify even living anymore is just to totally run away from who he is, his past, his responsibilities, his heritage. And he ends up in the jungle with some hedonists. He sings Hakuna Matata, and he tries to spend his days pleasuring himself without any stresses, without problems. And yet his redemption story is one of realizing the inherent emptiness and self-erasure that's failing to fully embrace who he is and become the best version of himself. That, rather than pretending to be something he's not, is what his existence, what his purpose is, and that doing so is the only way that he will fulfill his reason for being, and that ultimately the only way to contentment is to embrace and to become who he is. And it's not the subversive fellow lion Scar who has him realize it. It's not the hedonist. It's not the new Pride Rockians, the better Pride Rockians who are more Pride Rockian than the lionesses are. It's not any of those forces who set him straight. It is the wisdom and heritage of his own ancestors who set him straight.
That's not my father. It's just my reflection.
No. Look hard. You see, he lives in you.
Father?
Simba, you have forgotten me.
No. How could I?
You have forgotten who you are, and so forgotten me. Look inside yourself, Simba. You are more than what you have become. You must take your place in the circle of life.
How can I go back? I'm not who I used to be.
Remember who you are. You are my son, and the one true king. Remember who you are.
No, please, don't leave me.
Remember.
Father!
Remember.
Don't leave me.
Remember who you are. You're more than what you've become. A fitting message for Heritage America. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.